So there's this sermon that absolutely blew up online, and it makes a really bold claim about how the rest of the world sees the US president. In this explainer, we're going to deconstruct the key arguments from that sermon and the commentary around it, just to really understand this pretty unique perspective. It all kicks off with this one single, really provocative statement. The whole sermon is built on this core idea that while a lot of Americans might be critical of their president, people in other countries are actually celebrating. And this sentence right here, it's the foundation for everything else we're about to unpack. Okay, so to get our heads around this, we're going to walk through 5 key themes. We'll start with what they call the global contrast, then dig into why they think it exists. That's the spoiled and pampered thesis. After that, we'll look at this idea of an American hermit kingdom, then the crisis of faith they see as the root cause, and finally, what they're calling for, a mandate for change. All right, so let's dive right into that central claim. This idea that, the global view of the president is way more positive than what you hear at home. And look, this isn't just some vague claim they're making. They offer specific examples to back it up. The sermon says that people in places like Iran and Venezuela are literally celebrating. It even brings up a sentiment from Nigeria, quoting someone saying, "Please, Trump, come to Nigeria and deal with our issue." And they say this support isn't just in countries facing turmoil. It extends to allies like Australia and New Zealand, where people are supposedly happy and ecstatic. This quote, wow, it really captures the central conflict the pastor is trying to highlight. He's making the case that all over the world, people want to be American. He even mentions seeing people in remote villages wearing Lakers jerseys, but that Americans themselves are the ones pushing that identity away and taking all their freedoms for granted. So that raises a pretty big question, right? If this global support is as strong as they say, why is there such a huge disconnect at home? Well, the sermon and the commentary around it offer a very, very direct diagnosis. And that brings us to the second part, the reason they give for this whole disconnect. They call it the spoiled and pampered thesis. I mean, that assessment is about as blunt as it gets. The commentator really doesn't mince words. The suggestion is that a lack of real hardship, maybe an excess of comfort, has made Americans unable to see what they have and appreciate their country or its leadership. And to support this, they point to some very specific behaviors. They claim that a lot of Americans just never travel far from home, that a surprising number don't even have a passport. They also call out this attitude of, complaining all the time about local problems, high taxes, crime, but then not being willing to actually move to find something better. The big example they give is meeting people in Baltimore who've never, ever made the short 30-mile trip to see Washington, D.C. This flows directly into our next section, which really connects that spoiled mentality to one specific cause, what they see as a serious lack of global perspective. So the pastor uses this really powerful term, hermit kingdom. Now, usually when we hear that, we think of a place like North Korea, right? But he's kind of flipping it here. He's using it to describe a country where the citizens choose to isolate themselves, creating a worldview that's limited only to what they see and hear at home. And he tells this little story to illustrate the point. He says he'll ask Americans if they've ever traveled, and he gets answers like, yeah, I've been to Mexico, or even I've been to Hawaii, which of course is part of the US. He uses this to argue that for a lot of people, the whole idea of seeing the world is so narrow, it stops them from realizing that, in his words, there's no freer nation on the planet Earth. But this whole analysis, it doesn't just stop at the social or cultural level. According to the source, the real root of the problem is spiritual. They frame it as a deep crisis of faith. See, at its heart, this sermon isn't just a political commentary. It's a religious critique. The pastor says the fundamental issue is what he calls a lack of discernment. Basically, an inability for the church and its followers to properly understand the leaders and events of their time from a spiritual perspective. And this leads to a pretty fascinating, almost paradoxical argument. The pastor claims that throughout history, the world, and often even religious people, tend to hate the very leaders God chooses. He puts it out there as almost a rule. The one that the church hates is 99% God's choice. It's a massive challenge, really, to the judgment of his own audience. And the commentator adds this really stark number to drive home the idea of a spiritual crisis. He claims that a whopping 90% of churches in America have just lost their way, led by pastors who don't even believe the Bible is the true word of God. This number is used to paint a picture of a massive, widespread failure within the institution itself. Okay, so after laying out this whole multi-layered problem, from the social to the spiritual, what's the fix? What do they think should be done? Well, that brings us to our final section, a mandate for change. The commentator puts a really concrete policy idea on the table. He says it should be mandatory for every American right after high school to choose one of three paths: join the military, join the Peace Corps, or join the Merchant Marines. The goal is explicit: force people out of their bubble, give them a real global perspective, so they can then come back home and be appreciative of the nation that they have. But really, beyond any kind of mandatory service or government policy, the ultimate solution they present is a spiritual one. For both the pastor and the commentator, the only thing that can truly fix the problem is a national spiritual awakening. That's the only way, in their view, to correct that deep-seated crisis of faith and lack of discernment they've been describing this whole time. And all of that leaves us with this one big question to think about. When you deconstruct a sermon like this, it forces you to think about perception itself. How does a nation form its own self-image? And how can that image sometimes be so radically different from the way the rest of the world sees it? That's a question that goes way beyond any single leader or any single moment in time.